Decolonisation really means that it's like moving the value system from its extractive one to generous and more simple and slow one, taking into account the consumption of resources around you and like the harmonization of your own lifestyle with those resources being natural resources of people is crucial. It places the value of knowledge and storytelling and value system in these ways of seeing life and these community-based lives, simpler lifestyles at a higher value.
Welcome, dear friends. It's great to be back with you for another episode. Thank you to our newest members of All That We Are. We really appreciate you. If you love the show and haven't joined yet, please do. It's your membership that makes this show possible. Benefits include us keeping the podcast free and full length for all, as well as our monthly soul space sessions and going deeper. Head to allthatweare.org to join. This is another episode recorded in person, which I am loving doing again. Before the pandemic, I always recorded in person, which invited in this divine play of timing with people, needing to both be in the same place at the same time, know that we are both in the same place at the same time, and find the 2 hours to record, while still making sure there is an episode every week, and that I've had time to connect with the person that I happen to be in the same time and place as, so that we can sense into what might be an interesting theme for a podcast. I feel that with this, the podcast sends me on a journey. It always does anyway, as it brings different people into my attention at certain times. And this happens when I'm recording online too, but it really has a whole extra delight to it when recording in person. I have loved doing these last 6 episodes in person and being with the guests fully, breathing the same air. This episode sadly doesn't have the same sound quality we're used to due to an unforeseen tech issue. You can still hear it clearly, but we do apologize that it's not up to the usual listening experiences. Our voices sound just a little bit thinner than usual, but you can hear everything clearly. I want to give a thank you to Dr. Adrian Partridge, who gave us her space for this recording, who is a leadership coach who specializes in people-pleasing recovery. Our guest this week is Asmaa Guedira, who works at the intersection of system change, leadership, feminism, and regenerative futures. A decade ago, she left her career as a business consultant in PwC to become a catalyst wearing multiple hats: facilitator, consultant, artist, writer, and designer. A Moroccan nomad with a French passport, she uses the label she embodies to build bridges with artivists, entrepreneurs, and changemakers in over 20 countries. Asmaa explores the topics of diversity and inclusion, digital social innovation, and collaborative practices. As a consultant for the nonprofit sector, she managed programs in international development related to campaigning, movement building, and digital social innovation strategy. Some of her clients were the Humanity Foundation, UN, Hivos, JIS, or Mitost. Asmaa also designs and facilitates transformative learning experiences for leaders and change makers using emotional intelligence, mindfulness, creativity, and movement awareness with tools such as art of hosting and social presencing theatre. Her art addresses the colonization of our bodies and mind, our intimacy, identity, and the role of healing. Asmaa is a fellow on the Policy Center for the Global South and BMW Foundation Leaders Program, and is involved in various global networks like OuiShare, Amanitas, Global Innovation Gathering, Sandbox, and African Crossroads. She co-authored 2 books in French, Société collaborative and Le Manifeste de Crapauds Fous, and is currently writing her memoir about identity. In 2020, Asmaa moved to Bundjalung County, also known as Byron Bay, in Australia, where she runs eco-feminist retreats with WELA. Asmaa was a speaker on my summit, Style and Presence, a reclamation of worth, where she shared on the power of vision alongside our wonderful team member, Annegret Anna Folderback, and our inspiring friend and podcast guest, Swati Martin. In this episode called Roots of Humility, we explore the themes of nomadic communities, intersectionality, and decolonization as we speak to the question, how do we deconstruct binaries and colonial structures to flourish communities rooted in generosity? We hope that this conversation inspires you to deconstruct parts of your own identity and how you understand the world so that we may all be more free and more connected. Welcome to All That We Are with me, your host, Amisha Guedira. On this show, we explore the weave between activism, the sacred, creativity, and regeneration, the spaces where our inner and outer worlds dance. From healing trauma to nature connection, to new technologies to ancient wisdom, it's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a more beautiful future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to listen, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing and envisioning, we create the futures of our wildest dreams. And we begin to embody all that we are becoming, and all that is possible. I am delighted to welcome you here to All That We Are. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom and beauty with us.
Thank you for having me, Amisha. I'm also delighted to be here after all these years of friendship and the synchronicity of being together here in Paris. 4 years after seeing each other here for the same time is quite beautiful and feels really right.
Yeah, it's extraordinary to reflect on the last 4 years and how they've gone so quickly, and yet we've all been in such a deep place. But I'm sure we'll come back to some of that in a moment. And we're here with the sun pouring down on us in this beautiful Parisian apartment. I would love for you to share with us, what are the futures of your wildest dreams? And whether that's personal, collective, however that comes for you.
I really love this question because the word wildest in it is very strong, because I've spent the last few years living in wilderness with trees and wild animals, birds and goannas and echidnas and wallabies and all these animals that I've never heard of before. And I think the access and the immersion in that wilderness of animals, creatures, nature is definitely part of this wild future that I would hope for us and for everyone to experience. I guess the futures that I would dream of is a future where someone like me can walk freely in the world with the safety, the comfort, the trust, and the happiness that it takes to embody a lot of different identities that are, unfortunately, in the world where we are right now, very polarized. So a future where otherness is celebrated, where we live in harmony with our natural environment and with each other. And I guess it comes from embodying different kind of labels and instead of them being projected on you, having people seeing the richness of it. So as a Moroccan woman, I'm also African Amazigh, which is known as Berber, and the name of the First Nations people of North Africa and Morocco. I'm also Arab and Muslim and queer. And all these kind of different hats are a celebration for me, but it took me a lot of time to make peace with. And I would hope that more and more people like me would be able to walk free as I did,
and accessing the privilege of peace and freedom and safety. I really highlight the safety, especially of being a woman and being a queer woman. And I think very strongly of it because we're in Pride Month at the moment. Yeah, we're seeing the rights of queer people more at the same time, moving forward and also moving backwards and being attacked everywhere. So it's very important to remind that.
How do you weave together all of these identities? Of course, you also have spent a huge amount of your life in Paris, and you're in very global Western circles, in the changemaker world, and also the spiritual worlds and the eco worlds. They're very particular in the makeup. And so, yeah, for me, I'm really curious how you hold all these identities with such grace and openness.
And there's a lot of work behind it. I really appreciate the grace. Thank you so much. I've actually been writing a book about it that I thought would take 2 years, and it's been 4 years in the making. So I guess it's that integration is definitely a work in progress, and the openness to explore, the openness to be angry and feel the anger, but not get stuck in it, because different identity bring friction and bring microaggressions and trauma depending on where you are. That chameleon superpower of being involved and part of very different communities and societies. When I arrived in France, I moved to France in 2004, and I was the first of all my 8 cousins to go study in France. And like a lot of former colonies of European countries, I had very high in my head and my soul the French and European culture, and I was quite surprised and shocked to be confronted to the racism. And people used to ask me, "Are you Muslim?" And I would say, "No, of course not." And very strong atheism. My spirituality came way later. And my comfort with religion and different spiritual practices. But when I arrived, it was very strong French atheist, and highlighting the fact that I was born in Morocco and not a Moroccan, born a French person from Moroccan parents. So migrant, I was really making this distinction, which is a really good kind of example of how you react to the stigma. So that's how I was trying to protect myself and not move away from that stigma that I was seeing around people from African descent living in France and being born in France. It took me really traveling and coming across people from more culture. So when I became nomadic and moved to Berlin, I was really lucky to be a part of that city, multicultural city, where you have people coming from all over the world in quest for their own identity and celebrating each other's differences and diversity. And for the first time, I was like, "Oh, Morocco, beautiful, amazing." And the queerness of when I was in Paris, in 2011, the gay marriage was adopted, and there were big campaigns. And I was with my ex-girlfriend at that time, working in business consulting in PwC. So very different lifestyle than what I have now. I would hear my colleagues really giving me their opinions on, why gay people shouldn't be allowed to get married, and marriage was between men and women, etc. And I had to listen to that being still in the closet because I didn't feel safe until I did my coming out, and I got fired from it, really. So, and years later, now moving to Berlin, where queerness is celebrated, moving to Australia and Byron Bay, where my friends, lesbian friends, have babies together, and which is still not allowed in France. So things are moving slowly. So the ability to move between places and be able to migrate to these places has really opened for me the opportunity to, I guess, integrate these different identities, in addition to a lot of inner work. So therapy and healing and alternative practices, as you know very well, Amisha, have also helped me through these identity, through intangible, I guess, tools.
I feel like we're at such an interesting place on our global decolonization journey, where we're really at a very, very early stage of it. there's something in the Western mentality, which is like, okay, so we did that. We talked about it for a while. There were some books on it and now it's done. We're just such a tiny part into what is an epic process. Of course, that there is the decolonization of white people that might descend from colonizer families. And of course, we're talking about something that is so recent. Like my parents were born into, like my dad was born into colonized India, only just, my mum just after independence, but the same year. So this is so fresh. And yet we almost imagine it as something that happened a long, long time ago. And of course, it's still something that's very much happening today. We've seen recently with the death of the Queen and the coronation of King Charles in the UK, that there's still this global lavishing of a system that has caused so much harm. And one of the things I'm really interested in is the decolonization of people of color, because it's such an innate process of survival that we've all been part of. And it's really deeply complex. And I'm really curious where you're at in your kind of understanding around it and how we can liberate each other.
It's such a central reflection in my life and in our lives, because as theories and speaking and articles and writing, as like when a topic comes to the surface in the more public sphere and mainstream culture and start emerging more in conversations, it actually translates into very personal stories. It's been very interesting for me to see that topic emerge a lot while being in Australia. There's still a colony, and working and learning from Aboriginal people and First Nations people there, the echo chambers of different conversations happening, and they translate so differently for people who kind of deny the history, don't want to have a look at it because it hurts them and they have to face guilt and shame and cannot decorrelate that. And for people like us, where it's very linked to our personal stories, family stories, our identities. So in this conversation, I think there are like two sides. There's the deconstructing the admiration and awe of whiteness in the global majority, or global south, or third world countries. The non-PC way of saying it, where your parents come from, where I grew up, or my parents come from too. It's like deconstructing this like idealization of European Western culture. And it both come from people like us sharing their stories and from academics. I'm reading at the moment a book from David Graeber that a woman showed me at a retreat I was doing last week. It's a very thick book, 800 pages, but it's on the history of humanity, and it looks at how the Enlightenment age was actually informed by the contact of French people and European people with First Nation people in America, and how that was completely like removed from our history and the narrative that we have in our societies. And so I think giving back power and space to these different ways of seeing life that comes from the colony, the former colonies, with very strong spiritual practices as well, but without idealizing it as well, because these communities can also be very suffocating if there is no space for the individual to thrive or for identities to be fully embraced in safety. So yeah, I guess that's a very long answer to the fact that for me, the decolonization meant realizing that going to a French school, when I was in Morocco, my parents sent us to a French school because it was the best system available then. 20 years later, there's a lot of amazing Moroccan school, private, and the public sector is going a little bit better. Celebrating knowing the history of Morocco, the history of France as well is amazing, but I knew more about the history of France than the history of my own country. And I think that happens a lot for people of color around the world, and that the blur of migration is mixing us more and more. So doing your work to learn stories of your friends and read stories of people who are coming out and sharing a little bit more about where they are, where they come from, and moving the center of truth from what we've been taught is like that decolonization process that, takes both a very personal and intellectual aspect at the same time. I don't know if you have a similar kind of experience with your own process of decolonizing your own mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complex process because it really forces you to let go of everything that you know. That's scary because what you know is how you form your belonging and your identity. When you're opening doors that those around you aren't opening, you can't close them again once they've been opened. And I feel like this element that you mentioned, because one of the things that is prevalent in our modern lives is how much we long for community and we long for that sense of belonging that was inherent in many of the cultures in the global majority. And yet, many of us have experienced this path of really being able to express ourselves, to make decisions that have never been made before by anyone in our family, to spend our time in wildly different ways, to not have families in our 20s or, and to not be married and as the definition of who we are. It's incredible. And also there's an aspect of it that's terrifying because it's so far away from what has come before. And so I feel like there's this really interesting place that we're in right now with our understanding of decolonization and what we're trying to create in the future, which is that we want to now create communities where you're able to completely be who you are. And the very essence of completely following your own path often means letting go of those structures that kept you really safe. And so when I think about my parents' journey and what they gave up in order to create a different kind of life for me and for themselves, they had to let go of a huge amount of community and safety and belonging. I feel like that's a really interesting question of this time of how do we now recreate that sense of community and belonging where we are all more free? And is that something that's possible? Because, of course, I see us trying to do it in these really clunky ways that often then play back into colonization because it involves digital nomads and people going to countries that they're not from and gathering and creating these sort of new communities that are very, very economic and often don't give space for going deep into the ancestry of that particular place. So yeah, it's really confusing. I don't fully understand where we're going with all of it, how it unfolds.
Yeah, I don't pretend to have the answer, but it resonates quite strongly because when I got stuck in Australia and ended up deciding to move there, I very much left behind in an abrupt way, helped by COVID, obviously, that digital nomad lifestyle that was very fulfilling because it gave me access to people and to cultures, but it was also very lonely and isolating. And the communities, I've been part of many communities like you, digital communities, physical communities as well. But I found that most of these communities were very shallow, not grounded. Mm-hmm. And what I've learned from my Aboriginal friends, and I have a friend, Kyle, doing work with him and learning from 80,000 years of culture and building community and living with intense community connected with land and with people. Belonging comes with responsibility, the dynamic of respect, contribution, freedom, and responsibility is what's missing when in the sexy changemakers community. I re-employ your terms to stay with me from a conversation we had a few years ago. But I think that sense of being responsible and giving back to your community and not moving forward and running away when something better comes up or when a difficulty arises is what we're missing with that access to travel and privilege and freedom. And I think also, growing up with a passport that did not allow me to travel and making decisions to stay in France and, follow a career path that I really didn't want to do just to have a passport that enabled me to travel and to be free is something that gives me a perspective that a lot of people who are part of that global tribe don't really see, is the privilege of travel. And often the ease that comes with it has a cost. And that cost, you only see it after being in movement and ungrounded and sort of not being able to build the depth of relationship that you need to build community. Because communities are not just fun. There's a big part of it that's not fun. And if you just focus on the freedom and the individual sort of pursuit of happiness and of self, it becomes really narcissistic. And I think that's the balance between finding that structure and creating that structure and looking and respecting the structure while enabling yourself to be free is yet to find. And what I don't know if I probably idealizing a little bit, but the Aboriginal communities, but they are very strong type communities with strong rules and structure that are not only defined by the communities, but I said earlier, have different layers of spiritual connection, physical connection, and connection to the land as well, and to the self and the body. So these communities also allow people to just go walk about. So when you someone can just leave for an unknown period of time and do their own thing and come back to the community. And I think that space for me could be translated in a different way for the communities that we're trying to recreate. But what I've learned as well is that the importance of dealing with conflict and integrating how we look at conflict and how we look at tensions and the dark side of people, which arises inevitably in a community, is something that's been missing and that we need to kind of work on and develop, I guess, when creating the structures. It's like, don't run away when it gets hard. Stay with it.
And don't kick people out when it gets hard.
And know when you do your structure, when you create your structure together, not around one person, that it's going to get hard. And so create also rules for when it gets hard and how to deal with it. So, and that comes again with that contribution and responsibility. And probably something that's missing as well is the intergenerational component of being in a community. A lot of like the emergent or new communities are lack often intergenerational learning and eldership and babyship. Yeah, young people and older people kind of learning from each other and supporting each other.
And a sense of real rootedness. Because when you're dependent on each other in some way, when there is a really deep responsibility to each other, you find a way through conflict. You know, anyone that's in a long-term relationship, especially with children that have managed to stay together, have not done so because it's always easy and fun and wonderful. They've done so because they've learned how to navigate conflict together, and that they have put the values of their responsibility and the relationship they're creating and the beauty and the joy and the love that they experience, they prioritize those values. And so then when things do come up that are difficult, when they see parts of their partner that they're like, oh my gosh, like, you know, who's this? They're like, okay, cool. Like, you know, I'm going to meet this part of you. And yeah, we're going to find a way to figure out how we do the housework and how we allow ourselves the freedoms that make us feel alive and connected to our soul, and how we find ways to take it in turns, and how we address and rebalance when things feel like they're going too far in one direction. And I feel that that's the training that a lot of us have missed in the sexy changemakers world. Because there's always another place to go. Mm-hmm. There's always another thing to do. It means that often there's not the ways to go through those difficult patches. And for me, I found it really interesting over these years, and as I'm sure many did, that what then happens when you can't go and connect with these wonderful people in different places around the world. Yeah, who's there for the difficult moments?
Yeah.
And of course, without that grounding of like a physical place and real responsibility around kind of day to day, it's really difficult to recreate that. And at the same time, we live in this incredible time in our global story where we do get to cross-pollinate and we get to learn so much about different cultures and different people and different ways of being. And sometimes we do that by physically moving and traveling. And we're also able to do that through what we can podcasts we can listen to, people that we can connect with, and online communities that we can join. And I feel that often gives us something that is so powerful, because if I had stayed in the place that I was born, like that wasn't a place where I could fully make sense of my identity. And it wasn't a place where I could even find people that I could talk to about the things that were occupying my inner world and what I was seeing in our kind of collective understanding of the future. And so there's this balance around how we create really grounded lives that where we are invested enough and responsible enough in the communities that we're in, and we have space for this beautiful global cross-pollination, which is also where our perspectives shift and change. And a lot of this work, whether it's decolonization, whether it's understanding how interconnected this world is, where it's understanding how one action you make in one part of the world affects another. If you never leave the place that you're from, you never really understand that. If you are lucky enough to understand that you're from somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting because my ancestors a long time ago come from a nomad culture, and a lot of the human cultures are inherently nomadic, but the way people used to move before was connected to land. So they would move because of seasons, because of, access to food and grazing and shelter. And the way there are still nomads tribe today, nomadic tribes and Mazir nomad tribes in some parts of Morocco still. And the way they would move was between certain fixed places. So it's not like going everywhere where the flow takes you, but moving with intention and responsibility, and also moving together. That exchange that happens when in the movement, when you're rooted in the place, and also the pace of the movement, because you were used to move walking, or the ease and the speed of flying everywhere on your own and dropping in somewhere kind of erases that connection and that deeper layer of moving with intention and with purpose. I don't want to demonize it, because I've done it a lot and it brought me a lot. But it also, someone told me one day that the body can fly, but the soul moves to the rhythm of walking. So it takes a lot of time to integrate all these experiences that we accumulate. And I think people like you and I, who had the privilege to experience this lifestyle that is highly celebrated and pushed forward now, have also a responsibility to talk about the dark side of it and how to explore these lifestyles differently, because it brings personal suffering in that form of loneliness that we saw in the long term, but also it's absolutely unsustainable for the planet. And it follows that the digital nomad lifestyle format, as opposed to the original, traditional nomadic lifestyle, is really built on individualism and extractivism. It's people who have access to privilege, who move in places where their privileges allows them to work and live without necessarily being integrated in the place where they move and where we move. And I was part of it as well. So that takes time to not just be greedy and take what you have, but look at it in a broader and responsible way. Yeah, I guess the connection, again, the connection to the land, I like the localization, finding ways to build a few communities in a few places where your heart really belongs, and finding a pace to move that respects both the planet and your own needs and the needs of the communities that you belong to, is essential. And it's kind of a, I guess, sustainable way of doing it. And we have the ability to keep that that connection and that communication, really. And I'm thinking of the example of my my dad had created and run the social development agency of Morocco about 20 years. Basically, the model of international development is very much extractive and based on colonization. It's Western countries who go to global majorities countries, and through pouring money or giving resources and teaching you how to do things with the Western way are going to help these countries, which is absolutely not working and aligned. The model that my father had developed was basically still raising money from the Moroccan government, but also from like international funds like UNDP and World Bank, etc. But then hiring people from across all the country, local people who were already doing work, like teachers and activists and people working with their own communities to run different projects of development. So kind of like hacking the money. And I think that way of like seeing different small local pods, but connected through more layers of like organized national global structures, is like a way to move forward. So trusting, giving the trust and the power back to people on the ground who know the ground and who know their local communities as well. Knowledge is power. So when you see the knowledge of these people as powerful, it also like create the balance. And when we see ourselves that becoming that is actually more powerful than just roaming freely around the world, I guess is a way forward that I see. Again, it's my opinion from my personal lived experience.
I feel like we're being invited into a new way to understand all of this. During the pandemic, I really made peace with the fact that I might never leave England again.
Mm-hmm.
And that's completely wonderful. And I'll just root deeper into that community. And then it's been really interesting for me as I've traveled for the first time this year and been like, oh, okay, everyone is like still doing that, but it's even more so. And that actually, for many people, the pandemic, it opened up more travel, and it opened up kind of creating these different moving international communities. And so I feel like this is a really powerful moment of being invited to deeply consider how we do that in a way that, as you said, really brings in the lessons and the shadows. Because so many people have now lived like this for a long time and kind of understand like what happens. And that also there's a kind of addiction to these peak moments. And so then you get back to somewhere maybe that you grew up and you're like, oh, I can't be here. And it's like, actually, what is it to learn to be able to be anywhere? And what is it to know that you can bring the beauty of who you are and what you've learned into anywhere and open something up and connect into projects, get into relationship with the land, and that's something that is really possible at this time.
Well, I think us having this conversation is a part of it, is highlighting those shadows, sharing how they impacted us and ways that we've seen working, I guess, or possibly ways to reinvent it. So, it comes around everything that's linked to privilege. And I think the acknowledgement that this lifestyle is privileged lifestyle and that it comes to a cost of, other things like the local communities of Bali, typically the amount of pollution and the use of water resources that are way too much for the island. Or I see that in Morocco, in Marrakesh is like amazing international city and seeing people from everywhere, and it has helped, but also pushed everyone out with gentrification. Tons of pools and water just spilled out, so that the access to privilege needs to come with that awareness of the impact of those privileges. And again, sharing stories and reading and being aware of it. And it's hard, because it's not fun. It's less fun to, sit somewhere and have all these different shadows that you didn't want to look at that comes to your face. Because when you're constantly stimulated with novelty, with traveling, with meeting new people, meeting new places, and the low is going to come at some point in a way or another. So making sure to spend enough time and make space to be in service wherever you are. That giving back to the community when you're like in the same community, in the same place, if you're in the movement, think of like ways where you can replicate that, where you can give back to the place where you are, to the communities who were already there before you when you were there. And I think that it's a different it's a different mindset than just arriving somewhere and consuming everything that the place has to offer you, from culture to resources to beauty and and whatever is there for you to take and enjoy. And I'm not saying don't do that. I'm saying give back, find a balance, and that has to come with your own work and probably that connection with other people doing this work who live there and who have experience and who you can learn from. So I guess that attitude of humility when you move somewhere, that I learned from migrating to a country where I didn't know anyone. Nobody knew who I was. I had to start from scratch. So it's an experience that a lot of migrants know and a lot of nomads don't. I guess that sacrifice, that hardness, that giving back, and that humility. Yeah, probably now my mission is like bring that humility to this growing world of like travel and nomadism, because it's not going to stop. And we have a responsibility to do so for both the planet and the people.
It's so interesting when you say like the difference between nomads and migrants. And when migrants arrive somewhere and are judged and are discriminated against and are pushed out and don't get to access resources, when nomads arrive somewhere, it's like, oh, it's like a whole kind of playground that's like open to them, and anything that they might want and is available. And of course, we have migrants and we have nomads, and we also have an increasing number of refugees, for which it is like a whole other story. And we are experiencing politics, which is making that situation even more horrific. And of course, many of the refugees are climate refugees or are coming from wars that have very dark colonial histories and are examples of how neocolonization is playing out at this time. It's really something to be able to hold a perspective that sees all human beings and their rights to belong and to have access to water and food and shelter and safety, let alone Wi-Fi.
Yeah, I need my Wi-Fi, otherwise I can't survive. I mean,
and people do need their Wi-Fi in order to be able to do the jobs that they're doing to survive it. And so we've created all of these different layers of reality that all like live on top of each other, and it's bizarre.
Yeah. And what is the difference between these categories of people moving, really? Yeah, passport, privilege, birth. That's it. And I think bringing that awareness to the highest category of people in movement, which are digital nomads or expats, which is migrants coming from rich countries, is essential for the other people who don't have those privileges and those freedoms. So, and not thinking that one model is better than the other. It is really bizarre. And I'm thinking, typically, I met these two amazing women who were refugees in Australia and now are Australian. A great success story of moving to Australia. And they're both queer women, and they created like a support network for refugees and migrants or people in displacement who are queer as well, because a lot of people who come from migrant communities who are refugees and come from countries who are in war and conflict and who are queer at the same time experience like different layers of discrimination and don't have that support system of like arriving somewhere where they have been discriminated against and being like discriminated against strongly. So they find a way to give back, and that importance of, again, giving back, being of service, connecting people, sharing, using your privileges to help, is really the only way to move forward, because we're like just getting more and more polarized and putting each other in different categories and labeling each other with very strong identities and differentiations. And we're at the end, yes, we're different culturally and we're different, so we come from different walks of life, but everybody needs shelter, belonging, and safety. So, yeah, Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, I was having dinner with a really beautiful Iranian woman the other night, and we were talking about decolonization, and she was saying that in Iranian culture, like it's so based on giving. And so if I was to say to her, I really love your ring, like she gives the ring to me.
Oh, yeah.
I refrained from saying that I loved her ring after she told me that. And so when we look at colonization, it's often because there are such cultural differences of giving and taking that run so deep, where like homes, you know, if you come from a culture where like the home's open and there's always space for someone else to join the table, and there's always extra food, and it's always like, of course you can borrow this and have this, like that mentality is also what has led to what's happened in the world, because other cultures have come in and been like, okay, I'll have that, I'll have that, I'll have that. Like, thank you very much for inviting me to take from you. Yeah. Because it's not in a reciprocity of generosity. And so I feel like this is one of the huge values that we are being asked to understand at this time. When you meet people, say, from the Amazon, they live with such a culture of generosity. They're protecting a rainforest that provides for all of us. And right now, there is even more danger to what they're already having to protect that's coming through from mining and logging and a law that may or may not be passed this week. And so this idea that we do things that really don't just benefit us, and that we understand our purpose in this world as contributing in a way that's much bigger than us. And it's so different from the culture that we're sold, or the culture that we're indoctrinated in, which is all about like, make 7 figures, have this lifestyle. You know, your purpose is to be like wonderful and very highly resourced, and not to understand that your purpose might actually be to give all your resources away. Your purpose might be to work on something that contributes to something that you will not even see the benefits of in your lifetime, that might create benefits in 3 generations' time. And yet that is still something worth doing. In this process of decolonization, we are really being invited to understand our lives so differently. And how do you freely allow yourself to live in the value of generosity when we're also living at this time of completely toxic capitalism and taking advantage of every aspect of generosity, even from Mother Nature herself? It's a really complex moment that we're being invited into.
Yeah, that relationship to time and generosity. I grew up in a very strong hospitality culture like Morocco, and it comes from Amazigh culture. Is a gift-based culture. It's like opening the doors still today if you travel to like remote areas, and not even remote areas, but it's even more impressive if you're like in the middle of nowhere, or not in the middle of nowhere, but in a nature-based location, I guess. And people open their doors and share their food, and they don't have money. That culture of like giving and treating the other as the king is being eaten and taken away by capitalism. So it takes a lot of work and practice to bring it back and to model that, and knowing that some people will take advantage from it and not close up and just believe that this generosity will come back and will nourish each other. When you spoke about, you know, giving, doing something beyond you and beyond your lifetime, made me think of a conversation I had with a Maori friend, and he used to do a lot of work with forest, with reforestation and forests, and the group that he did a lot of work with was actually creating like landscaping and reforestation plans based on 300 years. So the base of the lifespan of a project is very different from the 2-3 years business plan that we've been taught. So how do we reintegrate that relationship to time that is slower? I love the movement that we see in some people of color activism, pushing rest as a form of protest and nap as a form of protest.
The nap ministry.
The nap ministry.
So inspiring.
Love it. It's a reaction to everything that we like. Yeah, we've been modeled to believe and to put as a higher model, this model of like success and speed and profit and taking over and fueling everyone narcissistic self. We all have like a narcissistic self.
What's a narcissistic time?
It is narcissistic time, like, and the digital space
and all of it. And just everyone having to make extraordinary amounts of money just to buy food and have shelter. Yeah. And like, it means that you have to tap into that in order to survive.
I had a conversation with my sister exactly yesterday. She's pregnant and she left a life in Paris with her boyfriend, and they're both working in a big companies, very stressed, the traditional urban, big metropolitan urban lifestyle in Western countries. But not only, it's spreading out in the global majority as well. So probably the capitalist lifestyle. They moved to a smaller town, Lille, an hour from Paris, and she became a chef and he became a brewer. She never felt happier, even though their income has been divided by a lot. And you and I know what we're talking about because we also like change lives to be more time rich and then resource rich and money rich, because the purpose and the meaning of it is deeper, because you can always try to fill that void with acquiring more and more and more, but it's never satisfying. And it's hard to make that decision. And coming back to the conversation where you said the decolonization, and that conversation is very important for people of color. To me, this conversation is also very important in the global majority as well, because the model that has been pushed is the capitalist model. It's the next development phase in the African continent, and the global majority is going to exhaust the planet way more than what we've seen before, because more and more people aspire to this lifestyle. So when having ties with the global majority also comes to me with like a responsibility to promote these alternative development models that are like slower, more generous, without idealizing the past, but like moving forward into building something, systems where everybody can thrive and not just a few, as we're seeing now.
It's about knowing what to protect, because as communities get more capitalized in their lifestyles, it's like you don't know what you're giving up until it's gone. And so those that have an understanding of what's been lost, to be able to step in and say, like, protect this. It's so beautiful. And it's so beautiful that people are aspiring to it, that have grown up in capitalism, late stage capitalism, and been really, they're now aspiring to these values and these ways of living that are still being lived. And it's so complicated to find that spot between access to resources and access to a beautiful life rooted in community and belonging.
Yeah, it makes me think of a conversation with my Bundjalung friend Kyle in Australia, who told me once, you should ask people of the desert, they know it all. When you think of the people of the desert who are nomad and live with very low resources, have seen it all, because their history and their ancestry were living in the same places before it was a desert. So they've seen change and they've seen adaptation. And I guess the generosity of the culture of people in Sahara, and probably people in the Australian desert, but I haven't met them, with a scarcity of resources, is actually a great lesson, because I'm not saying that everybody needs to live like desert nomads, but taking into account the consumption of resources around you and like the harmonization of your own lifestyle with those resources being natural resources of people is crucial. And again, it places the value of knowledge and storytelling and value system in these way of seeing life and these community-based lives, simpler lifestyles at a higher value than what we're seeing now that is based on extractive models. And I think that the decolonisation really means that it's like moving the value system from its extractive one to generous and more simple and slow one.
Thank you for tuning in. If you are enjoying this episode, do join our membership. For a small contribution, you can be part of our community, where we deepen the conversation and offer spaces of learning and embodiment. As a member, you are a patron supporting the making of this show, keeping the episodes full length, free and accessible for all. And you receive a number of benefits, such as monthly soul space, going deeper sessions, access to our library of workshops, and discounts on all our online and in-person experiences. Our membership is what makes us able to make this show and stay advertising free in a world that is always trying to sell us stuff we don't need. Head to allthatweare.org/membership to find out more and join today. I know for you, your journey around gender has been a really important part of your work and your understanding of your identity. And you've mentioned being queer. Can you share more around how you see gender at this time and what it means to you to be queer, to be a queer femme in this space?
Yeah, definitely. I think the ultimate meaning is allowing yourself to accept all the facets of your personality, of your identity, of the way you love and who you love, and deconstructing also what you've learned about what gender is and how a man or a woman or an intersex person should be. And now we're like seeing younger generation really completely at ease with like their gender identity, like deconstructing the binaries that we've been stuck into. And to me, it's still very political because in my birth country, it's still illegal to be queer, and in many others, it's still illegal to love who you are and to be who you are. And I'm also seeing at the same time, like everything in capitalism, like a individualistic take on queer identity with like a lot of pop culture and show around queerness, which are fantastic, but also create like a mono queer culture, which is definitely not how I see queerness. And I think we should always remember that, again, what we're learning from First Nations and Indigenous communities is that the expression of gender was always multiple and always accepted. And in Morocco, actually, the queerness being illegal comes from French colonization. There was no rules in previous Moroccan societies. You know, I'm not saying that we were allowed to be queer and free the way we are today, but the criminalization of it came with the French government. So it's really interesting to see like more and more people claiming back the way of like seeing gender as not a binary, coming from ancestral practices. And in Morocco, it's we have like a mythological figure called Amisha, who's like a powerful woman sorceress with with the feet of an animal. And it was also the symbol of men who would dress as women and behave as women. So like the two-spirit, I guess, category, but like the two-spirit people and that we see in a lot of different indigenous communities are also there. So it's really interesting to also look at how colonization has an impact on gender. And a big part of me not having moved back to my home country is really the inability to be freely who I am as a queer woman. I'm not sure how to reconcile that, really, but I know that it's a part of myself that is really important. And meeting other queer people has always been essential for me because it's meeting people who have been into the deconstruction process of decolonizing their minds around what gender is. And yeah, I probably feel more myself with that freedom around sexuality and gender identity and body as well, and relationship to body with queer communities than with any communities around the world.
I find that so interesting what you share around the difference between like understanding oneself as queer or understanding one's gender in a way of full expression versus, you know, as everything, as you say, in capitalism, that becomes like a uniform and like a kind of a way of being and maybe a way of walking, maybe a way of like a kind, this is the music and this is the look and this is, and so it actually it's molding on another rather than actually opening up to like, what is that identity within me and how does that move differently to the identity that I've been given. And I love that it's really an invitation to deconstruct oneself and to see what's there that comes from a very deep and authentic place.
I couldn't agree more. That deconstructions also comes with pain, like all deconstruction processes, and with facing discrimination and with facing your own judgment on yourself, to accept those part of yourself that you didn't learn were natural or like accepted. And I think that's in Pride Month. That's definitely the message that I'm really happy to share. And for younger generations to be able to be who they are and love who they are in a free and safe way. And just hoping that speaking up will continue to bring that safety of not hating yourself for who you are, really.
That's what I'm really taking from this conversation, is this shift in even consuming decolonization. You know, have you read this book? Have you listened to this? Have you, you know, and it then being like a kind of, yeah, it's hard to explain in words because, of course, you still need to read those books and listen to those podcasts and do all of those things. But there's something around like the how you're doing it and the why that is really landing for me as I sit here with you in this space. And I feel like I'm taking on a new understanding of like, of where that comes from, that openness to deconstruct and the understanding of what that opens up and the challenges that brings, but also really doing it for this part of yourself that is so connected to everything. It's the difference. It's like when I explain energy work to people, in my energy work, there's this process where we plant these seeds and then my clients have to water these seeds every day over time. And people often go, yeah, so it's like an affirmation and a visualization. And I'm like, no, like kind of, but not at all. Because when you're making an affirmation or a visualization, you're creating it from your mind. Whereas the shift that I'm inviting them to make through the energy work, it's not created through your mind. You're feeling it and experiencing it, and it's growing and it's showing you're not creating it. And I feel like that's something that was just landed for me in this conversation here around identity and around both decolonization and queerness, is that it's really allowing yourself to be in a process where you're shown something, not where you think something. And so it's approaching your understanding of who you are in this world. It's such a subtle shift, but it means everything in the way that you approach it, in the way that you allow it to expand you. And I feel like in order to do that, you really have to have this more indigenous understanding of what it is to be a human being on Earth right now. You have to have an understanding that is more interconnected with the more than human world, that is where you are in deeper relationship with the trees and the rivers and all that is, so that you understand these languages that are not just of mind and intellect, so that you understand the intuitive languages through which we are always being transformed.
That's a beautiful wrap up of everything, and like that, the embodied experience of moving through the world with multiple, when you're at the intersection of many labels and identities is really essential. And that embodiment goes in the body, but in the spirit, in the land, and in the people around you as well. And definitely the inner work part that you welcome in your clients speaks to me a lot.
What is the call to action that you would like to leave our friends here listening with? And it can be something that is on like an inner level as well as something they can support that's happening in the world.
On an inner level, relationship to time, place, and people. Take the time to reevaluate that for yourself and for the people around you. Bring like that slowness into it. On a more concrete level on doing in the world, there's like so many things I could pick. But when I was on the way to here, I was thinking of what's a really concrete call to action, like concrete things. My mother has a not-for-profit, an NGO called NEPTA, which means seed, or like little plant, not seed, really, in Moroccan, NEPTA Maroc, where she works with women in the peri-urban area of Rabat, to like very poor villages, and also in the desert near Mohamed El-Ghilvan with women and young people, teaching them how to take care of themselves, starting small businesses, and also education and reading and planting and permaculture. So if you want to donate, that's a good place to start. And if you want to keep reading, I'm putting together a website at the moment to publish poetry and hopefully my book soon. So yeah.
And how do people connect with you? Is the URL to your website that people can find you through?
Yeah, my Linktree has like the link to my website and different works and publications that I've done. So yeah,
we'll share that below.
Thank you so much.
Such a joy to be with you.
Yeah, it's been a very special moment and a very deep and meaningful conversation. Thank you for holding that space, Amisha.
My pleasure. And also to plant a seed, or maybe a little plant. Maybe we've already planted the seed. So to share the little plant that we are, feeling into hosting some retreats together to explore this work in a really beautiful embodied way. And so get in touch if you want to come and be in that process with us. And we're just nurturing this little plant right now.
I love that. Yes. Thank you. Ma salama, which means with peace and goodbye in Arabic.
Thank you for listening. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and it has sparked some inspiration and creativity in you. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on allthatweare.org. We give space to our guests to share their perspective without debating it or fact-checking, as this approach allows for deep, unedited conversations from the heart. We trust your discernment and wisdom to take what is useful and challenge what isn't in your own understanding. We offer spaces for discussion and integration in our membership community, which we would love for you to join. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible by you, our beautiful community. If you loved this and would like to connect more deeply with us, please join our membership. You choose what you contribute based on our sliding scale, and you become a patron whose support makes this podcast happen, as well as receiving access to a library of many resources and invitations to nourishing events. Please also hit subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen so others can find us. This podcast is made by an all-female global team. Me, Amisha Guedira, producer and host, Annegret Folderbach, who crafts the words that accompany each episode, and Mary Chan, who edits the sound so skillfully. All That We Are celebrates all that we are already and the untapped potential that lives inside us. It invites the full power of the more than human world, nature, the unseen, our ancestors and our future generations. It reminds us that we never exist in silo, through borders, timelines, or polarity, that in each and every moment, all that we are is here.